The night was dark and the river roared like an angry beast. Torches burned bright in the hands of frightened villagers. They gathered at the riverbank, their faces twisted with fear and anger. In the center of the crowd stood a young girl named Amara. She was only 12 years old. Her hands were tied with rough rope that cut into her skin. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the people she had grown up with. The people who once smiled at her now looked at her with hatred. Nshira stepped forward. She was a tall woman with a hard face and eyes that never showed kindness. Her voice was loud and clear as she pointed at Amara's chest. There, visible even in the firelight, was a strange silver mark shaped like a crescent moon. It had been there since Amara was born. "Look at this mark," Nshira shouted. "This is the sign of a curse. This child has brought bad luck to our village." The crowd murmured in agreement. The river behind them seemed to roar even louder, as if it too was listening. Amara's small voice trembled as she cried out, "Please, I have done nothing wrong." Amara searched the crowd desperately with her wet eyes. She looked for one face, one person who might save her. Finally, she saw him. Kido. He was her childhood friend, the boy who used to play by the river with her. The boy who promised he would always protect her. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Amara's heart filled with hope. "Kido, please tell them," she whispered, though her voice was too soft to reach him. But Kido did not step forward. Instead, he looked down at his feet. His shoulders slumped in shame. He could not meet her eyes again. Amara's last hope died in that moment. She realized no one would save her. Not her friend. Not the elders who watched silently. Not even the chief who stood at the back of the crowd with his arms crossed. Nshira smiled coldly. "You see, even those who knew her best say nothing. That is because they know the truth. She is cursed." The villagers nodded. Some even spat on the ground near Amara's feet. The ropes around Amara's wrists were pulled tighter by rough hands. She cried out in pain. The men began to drag her closer to the water's edge. The river was wild that night. Its waters crashed against the rocks with violence. Foam flew into the air like angry spirits. Amara's bare feet touched the cold mud at the river's edge. She could feel the spray of water on her face mixing with her tears. "Please," she begged one last time. "I am not cursed. I have only brought good things. The crops near my home grow better. The sick children I touch get well. Why do you not see this?" But Nshira's voice drowned out her words. "Throw her in. Let the river cleanse our village of this evil." Strong arms lifted Amara off the ground. She was light, like a bird. The men swung her body once, twice, 3 times. Then they released her. Amara flew through the air, her scream cutting through the night. She hit the water hard. The cold shock stole her breath. The current grabbed her immediately, pulling her down into the dark depths. The villagers watched from the bank. They saw her head go under once, then surface briefly. Her hand reached up toward the sky. Then she disappeared beneath the black water. Bubbles rose to the surface. Then nothing. Nshira smiled faintly and turned away. "It is done." Beneath the surface, Amara sank. The water was cold and dark. She could not breathe. Panic filled her chest as she struggled against the ropes. Her lungs burned. She kicked her legs, but the current was too strong. Down, down, down she went. The surface disappeared above her. She thought this was the end. She would die here in the river, innocent and alone. But then something strange happened. The water around her began to glow. A soft blue light spread through the darkness. The violent current that had pulled her down suddenly became gentle. Amara felt herself floating, not sinking anymore. The burning in her lungs eased. Somehow, impossibly, she could breathe. The water filled her mouth, but it did not choke her. It tasted sweet, like honey and rain. Through the glowing blue light, Amara saw shapes moving in the deep. Fish swam past her face, their scales shimmering like stars. Plants swayed gently on the river floor far below. And then she heard it, a voice, deep and ancient, like the earth itself speaking. "Amara!" it called. The voice was neither man nor woman. It was the sound of water flowing over stones, of rain falling on leaves. "Amara, child of the mark, you have been brought to me." The light grew brighter. Amara turned in the water, trying to find the source of the voice. Then she saw her. Rising from the depths of the river was a figure unlike anything Amara had ever seen. She was tall and beautiful, with skin that seemed to be made of flowing water itself. Her hair moved like currents, dark as midnight, filled with small fish and river plants. Her eyes were ancient, holding the wisdom of 1,000 years. She wore no clothes but was covered in patterns that looked like waves and ripples. This was the River Mother, the spirit that had lived in these waters since the beginning of time. "Do not be afraid, child," the River Mother said. Her voice echoed all around. "You are not cursed. You are chosen." Amara's eyes widened. She tried to speak, but only bubbles came out. The River Mother smiled gently. She reached out a hand that was both solid and liquid at once. When she touched Amara's forehead, warmth spread through the girl's body. Suddenly Amara could speak underwater. "Chosen for what?" she asked, her voice small and confused. The River Mother's expression grew serious. "The mark on your chest is not a curse. It is a blessing from the ancient spirits. You were born to serve as a bridge between water and earth, between spirit and flesh." Amara looked down at the silver mark on her chest. In the blue light of the river it glowed brightly. "But the village," she said. "They said I brought bad luck. They threw me away." The River Mother's face showed sadness. Humans fear what they do not understand. They call blessings curses when they are blinded by envy and ignorance. She gestured around them. "You brought life wherever you walked. Crops flourished. Sick children healed. The river sang when you were near. But Mama Nshira saw your gifts and grew jealous. She has no children of her own. Her womb is empty, and her heart has grown bitter. She convinced the village that your light was darkness." Amara felt anger rise in her chest, but also deep sadness. "What happens to me now?" she asked. The River Mother regarded her with those ancient eyes. "I offer you a choice, child. You may let the river take you to the realm of spirits, where you will know peace and never suffer again. Or you may stay here with me, learn the ways of the water, grow strong in your gifts, and one day return to the surface. But if you choose to return, you must face those who wronged you. You must carry the burden of truth." Amara thought for a long moment. Amara looked up toward the surface far above. She could barely see the moonlight filtering through the water. Up there was the village that had betrayed her. Up there was Keto, who had looked away. Up there was Mama Nshira, who had smiled as she drowned. Part of Amara wanted to let go, to drift away to peace and forget the pain. But another part of her, a stronger part, remembered the innocent people in the village, the children who had played with her, the old grandmother who had always been kind, the farmers whose crops she had helped grow. They did not deserve to suffer for Mama Nshira's lies. "I choose to stay," Amara said firmly. "I choose to learn and grow strong. One day I will return and show them the truth." The River Mother's face broke into a proud smile. "You have chosen well, brave child. But know this, time moves differently here in my realm. What feels like months to you will be years on the surface. When you return, you will no longer be a child. You will be a woman of power." She raised her hand and touched the silver mark on Amara's chest again. The mark blazed with white light, spreading across Amara's skin in beautiful patterns. It did not hurt. It felt like coming home. Years passed above the river. To Amara, it felt like only seasons. The River Mother taught her many things. She learned to speak to fish and understand the language of flowing water. She learned to see through the eyes of the river itself, watching everything that happened along its banks. She learned to command currents and calm storms. The river became her home, her teacher, her mother. But on the surface, the village began to change. At first, after Amara's death, things seemed fine. The villagers returned to their homes that night, some troubled, some relieved. Mama Nshira's influence grew stronger. She became an advisor to the chief, whispering in his ear about traditions and purity. But slowly, subtly, rot began to spread through the village. It started small. A merchant's dishonest dealings went unpunished because he paid Mama Nshira with gifts. A young girl's accusation against a powerful man was silenced because Mama Nshira said she was lying. Neighbors who once helped each other began to hoard food. Suspicion replaced trust. People started accusing each other of witchcraft and curses whenever anything went wrong. The joy that once filled the village square faded. Songs became rare. Laughter died. And Mama Nshira, sitting in her large house, smiled. She had become the most powerful person in the village, second only to the chief. But her heart remained as empty as her womb. Then the river began to change too. Fish that were once plentiful became scarce. Fishermen returned with empty nets day after day. The water that had always been clear started to look murky and brown. The river's flow became unpredictable, sometimes raging, sometimes barely moving. Crops planted near the riverbank, which had always grown tall and green, began to wither. The soil turned gray and lifeless. Elders gathered under the baobab tree to discuss what was happening. "The river is angry," one old man said, shaking his head. "We have done something to displease the spirits." A few of the elders, the ones with long memories, whispered a name that had not been spoken in years. "Amara," they said quietly. "Do you remember the girl with the silver mark? The one we threw in the river?" Others shushed them quickly. No one wanted to admit what they had done. No one wanted to face the possibility that they had made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, Mama Nshira heard these whispers. Fear gripped her heart for the first time in years, but she pushed it down. "Nonsense," she declared publicly. "That cursed child is long dead. The river's problems have nothing to do with her. We must simply make more sacrifices to appease the spirits." But privately at night, Mama Nshira could not sleep. She heard the river calling in her dreams. One morning, the villagers woke to find something terrifying. The river had flooded during the night, but only in one place. The water had risen and flowed directly to Mama Nshira's compound, surrounding her large house like a moat. Her garden was underwater. Her chickens had drowned. Her granary was soaked. But everywhere else in the village remained dry. The message was clear and impossible to ignore. The elders came to investigate. They stood at the edge of the water surrounding Mama Nshira's house. "This is not natural," the chief said, his voice troubled. Mama Nshira stood on her porch, water lapping at the steps. Her face was pale, but she kept her voice strong. "It is a test from the spirits. I will overcome it with prayer and sacrifice." That night, strange things began to happen throughout the village. People reported hearing voices in their dreams. A young mother woke screaming that she had heard a girl crying for help. A farmer swore he saw a figure walking inside the river, visible beneath the water's surface but never coming up for air. Kido, now a grown man with a wife and child, woke in the middle of the night shouting Amara's name. His wife shook him awake, frightened. "Who is Amara?" she asked. Kido's face was covered in sweat. "A friend," he whispered. "A friend I failed long ago." The village decided to hold a ritual at the riverbank. They would make offerings and beg the river spirits for mercy. The chief, the elders, Mama Nshira, and most of the villagers gathered as the sun set. They brought goats, cloth, cola nuts, and palm wine. A priestess, old and bent with age, led the ceremony. She sang ancient songs and poured libations into the river. The villagers knelt on the muddy bank, their heads bowed. "Great river, forgive us," the priestess chanted. "Accept our offerings and show us mercy. Restore our fish, heal our crops, bring back your blessings." The river was calm that evening, unusually still. As the moon rose full and bright in the sky, the priestess raised her arms toward the water. "If there is any spirit who speaks for the river, show yourself now. Tell us what we must do." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water began to glow. That same blue light from years ago spread across the surface. The villagers gasped and stepped back. Mama Nshira's eyes widened in terror. She knew that light. She had seen it before. The water at the center of the river began to rise, forming a column. The column took shape, forming the figure of a woman. She stepped out onto the surface of the water. Walking toward them, she was radiant, dressed in flowing white cloth that seemed to be made of river foam. Her dark hair fell in waves down her back, and on her chest, visible through the thin fabric, was a glowing silver mark shaped like a crescent moon. The villagers froze in shock. Mama Nshira collapsed to her knees. Amara had returned. Amara stood on the water's surface, looking at the crowd of villagers. She was no longer the frightened 12-year-old girl they had thrown away. She was a woman now, perhaps 20 years old, tall and graceful. Her eyes held power but also sadness. She looked at each face in the crowd. Some she recognized, now older and weathered. Others were children who had been born after she disappeared. The silence stretched long and heavy. Finally, an old woman at the front of the crowd fell to her knees. "It is the girl from the river," she whispered. "The one with the mark. She has returned." Others began to kneel too, some out of respect, others out of fear. But not everyone knelt. Some villagers stepped back, their faces filled with terror. "She is a demon," one man shouted. "The river has sent a demon to punish us." Amara's voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but carried across the riverbank like ripples on water. "I am no demon," she said. "I am Amara, daughter of this village, thrown into this river because you feared what you did not understand." Her eyes found Mama Nshira, still collapsed on the ground. "I have returned because the river has shown me everything. Every lie, every cruel act, every truth that was buried." The chief stepped forward cautiously. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice shaking. Amara looked at him with those ancient eyes. "I want the truth to be told publicly. I want those who lied to confess. I want justice." The crowd began to murmur nervously. People looked at each other with suspicion and guilt. Amara raised her hand and the murmuring stopped. "Let me show you something," she said. She gestured toward the river. The water responded to her command, rising up to form a shimmering wall behind her. Images began to appear in the water like reflections, but they were memories. The villagers saw themselves on that terrible night years ago. They watched as young Amara was dragged to the river, crying and begging. They heard Mama Nshira's accusations. They saw themselves participating in the murder of an innocent child. "I remember every face," Amara said quietly. "I remember who threw the stones. I remember who held the ropes. I remember who stayed silent." A man in the crowd suddenly fell to his knees. His name was Obi, a farmer. "I lied," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "Mama Nshira came to me before the gathering. She gave me money. She told me to say that my crops failed because of Amara's curse. But it was not true. My crops failed because I did not tend them properly. I spent my time drinking palm wine instead of farming." The crowd gasped. The water at Obi's feet began to rise, creeping toward him like living fingers. He scrambled backward in terror. "Forgive me," he cried. "I am sorry." Amara looked at him with pity. "The river hears your confession," she said. The water stopped rising and slowly retreated. Obi collapsed in relief. Another person stepped forward. It was Kido. He was a man now, tall and strong, with the bearing of a respected member of the village. But his face was twisted with shame. He walked through the crowd until he stood directly in front of Amara. She looked at him without expression. "Amara," he said, his voice breaking. "I have carried the weight of my cowardice every day since that night. I should have spoken. I should have defended you. You were my friend. You saved me once when I fell into the river as a child. But when you needed me most, I looked away." Tears fell from his eyes. "I do not ask for your forgiveness because I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that my silence has haunted me every day." Amara studied his face for a long moment. The river around her feet rippled gently, as if considering. Finally, she spoke. "I forgive you, Kido." Relief flooded his face. But Amara continued. "However, forgiveness does not erase consequence. You taught your children to stay silent in the face of injustice. You became a man who valued his comfort over truth. That is the price you paid for your cowardice." Kido bowed his head, accepting her words. He stepped back into the crowd, but the river did not react to his confession. The water remained still and dark. Amara turned to face the entire crowd. "Mercy alone is not enough," she said. "Truth without consequence teaches nothing. Justice must be balanced." Her eyes fixed on Mama Nshira, still kneeling on the mud. "And justice begins with the one who orchestrated it all." Mama Nshira slowly raised her head. Her face, once proud and hard, now looked old and frightened. But there was still defiance in her eyes. "What do you want from me, river demon?" she spat. "You come here with your tricks and lights, trying to turn the village against me. But I did what was necessary to protect our people." Amara took a step forward, still standing on the water's surface. "Protect them, or protect yourself." The water behind her shimmered again, forming new images. The crowd watched in horror as the truth unfolded. They saw Mama Nshira in her youth, beautiful and full of hope, marrying a wealthy man. They saw her joy turn to desperation, as years passed without children. They saw her visiting herbalists and witch doctors, spending all her husband's wealth trying to conceive. Then they saw her husband take a second wife, a younger woman who quickly became pregnant. The images showed Mama Nshira's rage and jealousy. They watched as she poisoned the second wife's food, causing her to lose the baby. The second wife survived but became barren, and the husband sent her away, blaming her. Mama Nshira's husband died soon after, and she was left alone, wealthy but empty. The crowd gasped. "She killed a baby," someone whispered. "She poisoned the second wife." Mama Nshira's face went white. "Those are lies," she screamed. "River tricks, spirit deception." But Amara continued. "When I was born with a silver mark, when my gifts began to show, you saw in me everything you could never have. I could bring life. I could heal. I was loved for who I was, not what I owned. And you could not stand it." The ground beneath Mama Nshira's feet began to crack. Water seeped up through the splits, cold and dark. She tried to stand but stumbled. The villagers stepped away from her, horror and disgust on their faces. "You orchestrated my death," Amara said, her voice still calm but filled with power. "You spread rumors about my mark. You paid people to lie. You convinced the village that an innocent child was a curse. All because your own heart was so full of bitterness that you could not bear to see joy in others." Mama Nshira looked around desperately for support, but every face had turned against her. Even the chief, who she had advised for years, looked at her with contempt. Amara stepped closer, now standing on the muddy bank, the water following her like a loyal pet. She knelt down, so she was eye level with the collapsed woman. "I offer you one chance, Mama Nshira, one opportunity for redemption. Confess your crimes publicly. Ask for forgiveness from the village and from me. Accept the consequences of your actions. Do this, and the river will show you mercy." For a moment, something flickered in Mama Nshira's eyes. It might have been regret or fear or the faintest spark of conscience. The crowd held its breath. Would she confess? Would she humble herself? Mama Nshira's lips trembled. Then her face hardened into a mask of rage and pride. "Never," she hissed. "I would rather die than beg forgiveness from a cursed child. You are nothing. You were nothing then, and you are nothing now." The river responded immediately to Mama Nshira's refusal. The water that had been seeping through the cracks in the ground suddenly erupted upward in fountains. It surrounded Mama Nshira on all sides, creating walls of water that trapped her. She screamed and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Amara stood and raised her arms. "Then let the river remember for you," she said. The walls of water began to shimmer and glow. Images appeared in them, more vivid than before. But these were not just memories. They were the actual moments, preserved by the river, playing out in perfect detail. The crowd watched transfixed as the events of that terrible night replayed before their eyes. They saw Mama Nshira going from house to house in the days before, whispering poison into people's ears. They heard her lies about crop failures and sick children and bad omens. They watched her pay Obi and others to give false testimony. They saw her standing by the river that night, her face not filled with righteous duty but with cruel satisfaction. They watched young Amara's face as she was thrown into the water, the betrayal and pain in her innocent eyes. Some villagers began to cry. Others turned away in shame. But they could not escape the truth. The water showed everything. When the images finally faded, Mama Nshira was on her hands and knees, surrounded by water. Her expensive clothes were soaked and muddy. Her hair hung in wet strings around her face. But still, she would not surrender. "You cannot judge me," she shouted at Amara. "You are not a god. You are just a girl who was lucky enough to survive the river." She tried to stand, pointing a shaking finger at the crowd. "And you, all of you, you participated. You threw the stones. You tied the ropes. You watched and did nothing. You are all guilty too. Why should I alone be punished?" It was a desperate attempt to deflect blame, to drag others down with her. And there was truth in her words. The villagers had participated. They had been complicit. But Amara shook her head. "You are right that they share guilt," she said, "and they will have to live with that truth. But there is a difference between being deceived and being the deceiver. Between following out of fear and leading with malice. You were the architect of injustice. They were the tools you used. Mama Nshira's face twisted with rage. She lunged toward Amara, fingers extended like claws. "I curse you," she screamed. "I curse your mark, your gifts, your—" But her words were cut off as the water rose up and grabbed her. It wrapped around her waist, her chest, pulling her backward. She fought against it, but the river was too strong. "No," she screamed. "No, no, no!" The water dragged her toward the river's edge. The crowd watched in terrified silence as Mama Nshira was pulled into the river. But Amara raised her hand, and the water stopped. Mama Nshira was held suspended half in and half out of the river, unable to move. "The river does not want your death," Amara said. "Death would be too easy. It would end your suffering too quickly." She gestured and the water changed. It swirled around Mama Nshira's throat, not choking her but touching her skin with cold fingers. When the water finally released her and she fell to the muddy bank, something had changed. Mama Nshira tried to scream but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, taken by the river as punishment for all the lies it had spoken. She clutched at her throat, her mouth opening and closing uselessly like a fish on land. The crowd watched in awe and fear. Amara looked down at her without pity. "You used your voice to spread poison, so your voice is taken. You used your wealth to corrupt, so your wealth will be scattered. You used your position to destroy innocence, so your position is removed." As she spoke, the water began flowing through Mama Nshira's compound in the distance. Villagers could hear the sound of wood breaking and thatch tearing. Her house, her granaries, her possessions were being washed away by the river's power. Mama Nshira collapsed, silent tears streaming down her face. She had lost everything. Her voice, her home, her power, her reputation, all gone in moments. But she was alive. She would have to live with what she had done, unable to speak, unable to influence, reduced to nothing. It was perfect justice. Amara turned away from Mama Nshira to face the rest of the village. The people knelt before her, their heads bowed in shame and fear. "Stand up," she said gently. They obeyed, rising slowly. "What happens now is your choice," Amara continued. "The river has shown you the truth. You know now what you did. You know that you allowed fear and lies to guide you instead of compassion and wisdom. You murdered an innocent child because you were too afraid to stand up against injustice." The words hit them like stones. Some people began to cry openly. "But," Amara said, and her voice softened, "you were also deceived. You were manipulated by someone who understood your fears and used them against you. That does not erase your guilt, but it explains it." She gestured to the river behind her. "The river will leave your village alone if you choose to change. If you choose to build a community based on truth instead of fear. If you choose to protect the vulnerable instead of casting them out. If you choose to question accusations instead of believing them blindly." The chief stepped forward. He was an old man now, his hair white, his back bent. "What must we do?" he asked humbly. Amara considered him. "Start by teaching your children what happened here. Tell them about the girl with the silver mark who was killed for being different. Tell them about the price of cowardice and the cost of silence. Make sure this never happens again." One by one, the villagers began to kneel again. But this time it was not out of fear. It was out of remorse and the desire for redemption. "We will change," they said together. "We will remember. We will teach. We will be better." The moment the villagers made their pledge, the sky began to change. Clouds that had been gray and heavy for months started to break apart. Sunlight streamed through in golden beams, illuminating the river and the gathered people. Then, soft and gentle, rain began to fall. Not the violent rain of storms, but the sweet rain of blessing. The villagers lifted their faces to the sky, letting the water wash over them. It felt like forgiveness. Within hours, the change was visible. The river's water, which had been murky and brown, cleared to crystal blue. Fish began to jump on the surface, more than anyone had seen in years. The crops that had withered in the fields suddenly stood straighter, their leaves turning green again. Amara walked along the riverbank, touching the earth gently. Everywhere her feet stepped, flowers bloomed. The soil that had turned gray became rich and dark again. Life was returning to the village, flowing from the river like a gift. The people watched in wonder and gratitude. But as the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Amara stood at the water's edge looking thoughtful. The chief approached her carefully. "Will you stay with us?" he asked hopefully. "Now that peace is restored, will you live in the village again? We will build you a house. We will give you honor. Whatever you need." Other villagers gathered around, adding their voices. "Yes, stay with us. Be our teacher, our guide, our protector." Amara looked at their eager faces. She saw genuine remorse and hope there. Part of her, the part that remembered being a little girl playing in the village square, wanted to say yes. But she shook her head gently. "I cannot stay," she said. Disappointment crossed their faces. "But why?" a young woman asked. "You have brought us back to life. We need you." Amara smiled sadly. "You do not need me. You need to learn to stand on your own feet, to make your own decisions based on truth and compassion. If I stay, you will simply follow me. You will look to me to solve every problem, to judge every dispute. That is not growth. That is dependence." The chief frowned. "Then who will lead us? Who will make sure we stay on the right path?" Amara turned to look at the crowd. Her eyes settled on several people. The old priestess who had led the ritual. Keto, who had confessed his cowardice and now carried that wisdom. A young mother who had spoken out against injustice in the past but been silenced. A farmer known for his fairness. An elder respected for her wisdom. "You will lead yourselves," Amara said. "Create a council of people who value truth over power. Listen to many voices, not just one. Protect those who are vulnerable. Question those who seek control. Learn from your past and build a better future." She touched each of the people she had chosen on the shoulder. "I appoint these 5 as the first council. But they do not rule. They guide. And if they become corrupt or cruel, you must replace them." The 5 people Amara had chosen looked at each other with surprise and humility. They had not sought power, which was exactly why she chose them. The chief bowed his head in acceptance. He was old and tired, and part of him was relieved to share the burden of leadership. "We will do as you say," he promised. As night fell fully, the village prepared a feast. They roasted meat and cooked yam and made palm wine. They invited Amara to sit at the place of honor. She accepted, not because she wanted glory, but because she understood they needed this moment of celebration and closure. The food was delicious, reminding her of childhood meals she had almost forgotten. Children ran around the fire, laughing and playing. Music filled the air for the first time in years. But as the celebration continued, Amara felt something pulling at her heart. It was the river calling her. The river mother's voice echoed in her mind, gentle but insistent. "It is time, child. Your work here is done." Amara stood quietly. Most people were too busy celebrating to notice. She walked away from the firelight toward the river. Only a few saw her leave. Keto was one of them. He followed at a distance, not calling out, just watching. When Amara reached the water's edge, she turned back to look at the village one last time. The warm glow of the fire, the sound of laughter, the sight of people dancing and celebrating. This was the village she remembered from her childhood. This was home restored, but it was not her home anymore. She belonged to the river now. That was the price and the gift of her survival. Amara removed her outer cloth and stepped into the water. It welcomed her like a mother's embrace, warm despite the cool night air. She waded deeper until the water reached her waist, then her chest. Keto, watching from the bank, finally called out, "Amara, wait!" She turned to look at him. "Will we ever see you again?" he asked, his voice carrying across the water. Amara smiled. "When you need me most, I will return. When injustice threatens again, when the innocent cry out, when the river calls me. But I trust you to build something good here, something worth protecting." Keto nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for forgiving me," he said. "Use that forgiveness to teach others," Amara replied. "Tell them that redemption is possible, but it requires change, not just words." With those final words, Amara dove beneath the surface. The water where she disappeared began to glow with that familiar blue light. It spread across the river, beautiful and ethereal. Keto and the few others who had followed watched until the light faded. The river flowed peacefully, its song gentle in content. Amara had returned to the river mother, no longer the frightened child who had been thrown away, but a guardian who had fulfilled her purpose. She had brought truth, justice, and ultimately, the possibility of redemption. The river had claimed her twice, once as a victim, now as a chosen daughter. Years passed again. The village prospered under the guidance of a council Amara had established. They never forgot what happened. Every year, on the anniversary of Amara's return, the villagers gathered by the river for a ceremony. They told the story to their children and their children's children. The story of the girl with the silver mark. How fear had led them to commit a terrible wrong. How truth had returned from the depths. How justice had flowed like water. The story spread beyond their village to other towns and villages. It became a legend told by travelers and traders. Some said it was just a tale meant to teach children about the dangers of prejudice. Others swore it was true, pointing to the prosperity of that particular village as proof. But the villagers knew. They had seen it with their own eyes. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full, people swore they could see a figure walking on the river's surface. A woman with a silver mark on her chest, watching over them. Mama Nshira lived out her days in silent isolation. Without her voice, without her wealth, without her power, she became invisible. Some said that in her final years, she would sit by the river every day, staring into the water with tears in her eyes. Perhaps she finally found remorse. Perhaps she simply mourned what she had lost. No one knew, because she could not speak. The village learned many lessons from Amara's story. They learned to value differences instead of fearing them. They learned to question accusations instead of believing them blindly. They learned that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit. But most importantly, they learned that what you try to destroy out of fear will always return. Truth cannot be drowned. Justice cannot be buried. Love cannot be killed. Like water, these things always find their way home. And now I ask you, dear listener, what would you have done? Would you have thrown the stones? Would you have looked away? Or would you have stood up for the innocent, even when everyone else was silent? Remember Amara's story. Remember that blessings often come in forms we do not recognize. And remember that the river always remembers.